Tacitus today. Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today on your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio, no pictures live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the issue of what sort of punishments can act as deterrents for criminals. Now, if you look at the prison populations of any Western country, whether it's even before or after mass migration, you'll notice a heavy overrepresentation of non-white people in the prison population. Now, if you look at the United Kingdom or United States or Canada or Australia, then non-white groups are overrepresented in prisons by sometimes 4 to 5 times the number of what their population would be. So you've got this crazy situation where 12% of the population are non-white, are black, for example, but 52% of the murders are committed by black people. You say, well, that's impossible. Now, a lot of the discussion around has, well, the only reason that black people get put in prison, mainly for killing each other, by the way, but nonetheless, but being put in prison or arrested and charged is because of racism. Now, given that there's blacks killing each other, I can't find the racism card to play there. But anyway, clearly prison is not a deterrent. And also something that's rather intriguing is the amount of non-white people who are repeat offenders. Now, sometimes these offences are for lower level things. Maybe it's drug dealing or drug usage or something like that. So you say, well, is that really a threat to the community, or should those people go to prison for that sort of thing? And there is certainly an argument to be made for if the crime they're supposed to commit didn't involve theft, or as in like stealing a car or something. I don't mean like stealing a chocolate bar from the local store, but if the crime didn't involve some sort of manifest violence against people or property or damage, that sort of thing, then is prison really an option? So you could talk about that, but there's also an increasing issue, probably more brought out today because of the woke nonsense we're seeing around the place, evil white man and that sort of stuff, that the laws are white man's law, and because they're white man's law administered by white people or white judges or white police officers or prosecutors, that it's not legitimate. Not only is it not legitimate, it's 100% illegitimate. So if it's a completely illegitimate law or set of laws or administration of law, administration of justice, why should I, argues the non-white person, why should I be bound by that? Just because they say I can't kill and steal and they are illegitimate, then why can't I kill and steal? That must be legitimate given what they are illegitimate. So there's various ideological things ping-ponging around within this, and but some of the suggestions flying around, and I can't imagine they'll get a whole lot of traction, but is prison detention working with these people? And if not, would other punishments work? And what other punishments? Now, the electric chair or something like that, that's getting at the drastic end of things, but euthanasia is considered acceptable, and coercing and bribing and intimidating people into euthanizing themselves is getting a lot of. How is that different from killing somebody, through the state, as in the electric chair or lethal injection or whatever it is? So this is a much bigger subject and more nuanced than prison or no, social workers or no, physical punishment or no. It's far more nuanced than that. Cuts across a number of things, not only in race and class and ideology and so on. So this is what I'd like to dive into in this essay. It's a big subject, and I'm going to make a quick pass at it. So, but the bottom line, do harsh pain-inflicting punishments work as a deterrent? I just want to talk about, he's a Jewish guy in Hungary, so Jewish, and the Nazis are at this stage, Hungary is an ally of the Nazi regime, the National Socialist government in Germany, Hitler's government. And the Hungarians, the Hungarian government isn't that keen to go locking up Jews or handing them over to any Nazi ideologues. And particularly Jews that have any sort of skills that are needed in the community or needed for the war effort, these sorts of things. And there's a marked reluctance by the Hungarian government to touch these people. Now, just as the Russians are about to invade Hungary, the Hungarian government kind of just capitulates to the Russians, the inevitable occupation at this point, the Soviet Red Army, when I say the Russians. So capitulate to the Red Army, and at that point, the Germans occupy Hungary formally, and it becomes an occupied territory. And this is late in 1944. So there's a narrow window where, 6 months or so. There's a narrow window where the Nazis are in control of Hungary, and it's got not a huge but a decent sized Jewish population at the time. So now this guy who I know and I've spoken to, he was like 12 or 13 years old or something when the Nazis occupied. But now remember, they're allies of the Nazis beforehand, so there are Nazis, Nazi government officials running around the place and so on. Now he remembers his father, who was Jewish, was some like local mayor or local town clerk or something like that. And so the Nazis would come by, or some sort of Nazi official would come by and say, here are the names of some Jewish people. We'd like you to gather them together and present them to us to be interviewed, which was code speak for we may detain them and take them off to a concentration camp or something. And his father wouldn't do it, and he would argue, well, no, this person's needed for the war effort. They work in, maybe they're an engineer in a munitions factory or something. Or one he remembered was somebody was a dentist or something like that. So, a doctor or a dentist, and they were needed they were the only doctor in the township, the only dentist. So no, we need them. You can't have them. And he would find an excuse not to hand over anybody. Now, this guy was in the office, sort of sitting in the corner, listening to his father talk to the Nazi officials, and he remembers the Nazi officials were quite polite. They didn't push it. They would ask, but did not insist. They weren't heavy-handed, or they would just ask. That was it. And if he said no, then they would just, all right, well, thank you for your time, and they'd walk off. So he was, that's something that he remembered. Now, when the Nazis took over, when the Hungarian government capitulated to the Red Army, and the Nazis took over, they issued a lot of rules, and do this, have to do these are the rules now, and so on. And one thing that he remembers is that the Nazis were very, very clear about their, very specifically, very clearly worded. There was no ambiguity. There was no vague sort of ideological type stuff in there. It was all very clear. If you adhere to these rules, you'll have no trouble from us. And he remembers that. And remember, he's not an old man or even really at working age at that time. He's in high school, for goodness sake. So, but he remembers that, and he remembers his father saying, "Look, stick to the rules, and they'll leave you alone." And remember, they're Jewish, for goodness sakes. But that was how it was. And so then he remembers he was there. He was, like 15 or something when the communists came, the Soviet communists, and he remembers the stark difference that the communists would be very vague on the rules of what they required. They were constantly trying to entice you to like a false flag sort of thing, trying to entice you to get up at a town hall meeting and say, well, I think we need this or that in the government, right? Because then you'd be identified as a potential leader. And if you're a potential leader, you were then a potential subversive. If you're a potential subversive, they wanted to kill you. The Soviet communists would want to kill you. So he learned very quickly, as he puts it, that the communists would had these very vague laws where they could arrest you for anything, and the law could be interpreted in whatever they wanted, and they didn't believe they had any burden of proof to meet. They could simply accuse you of being a counter-revolutionary or accuse you of being an enemy of the people. That was it. You were finished once it got to that. The Nazis, however, as much as it may seem, especially given the guy was Jewish, or his family was Jewish, the Nazis did perceive they needed to meet some sort of burden. Here are the very clearly codified rules. You've broken these rules by doing this. And so there was a burden of proof that the Nazis, even though they're dealing with Jews, had to. So here's this Jewish guy under Nazi occupation that says, I preferred the Nazis to the communists. Because with the Nazis, you knew where you stood. They were very clear on it. With the communists, you never did. They'd always pretend that they were doing the right thing or pretend that they cared, but in fact, their laws were ideological. So that was an interesting sort of thing. A Jewish guy under Nazi occupation prefers the Nazis to the communists. I mean, that's insane. The guy's been doing too much lines of coke off the toilet seat or something. But no, he was a smart guy, and it was interesting that he would say that. And it boils down to clearly codified law. And this was certainly the takeaway that I'm looking at here. Now, why are some groups undeterred by the prospect of spending time in prison? These laws, as I mentioned earlier, these laws are white man's laws, they're Christian laws, they lack legitimacy. So should the state issue physical punishments and thus have to meet a higher burden of proof? Now, arbitrary, I was pretty much all my schooling was during the time of corporal, as in the canes or the strap or something like that, corporal punishment. So, and I went to a number of different schools. Folks travelled around quite a bit, and I went to schools in well-to-do areas, a school in a not very well-to-do area, an upmarket private school, and so on. So I went across it. So I saw a different cross-section by class, by racial groupings and homogenous groupings, non-homogenous groupings. So I had a real cross-section of schools, and the type of corporal punishment issued in each school was quite different depending on the attitudes and circumstances and I suppose population mix, class type thing that applied. Now, I guess I came away with the view that corporal punishment, as in the cane or the strap, doesn't work with some groups. So I was at a school that had a very large population of Arabs, like from the Middle East, and I was mercifully not at that school for very long, but thank fuck for that. These people, this school, they used to have public canings. There'd be Yusuf and Muhammad and everything would be queuing up they'd have them lined up and they'd have these public canings in front of the whole school. I suppose it was almost had a prison feel about it. The police were around every day at this school. It was insane. But the punishment was handed, these corporal punishments, the canings and so on, were handed out disproportionately to non-white. White kids used to get it too, but it was non-white kids. It seemed to be always in the group. And now there was majority brown, the school. So, but the Arab sort of group would be, I don't know, 10% of the kids, but they seemed to be heavily overrepresented in the caning, the kids that were lined up for caning. And one thing that surprised me is it didn't seem to deter them, even though they were caned. Some of these kids were being caned nearly every fucking day, but it didn't seem to deter them. Instead, they didn't view the punishment or the causes or reasons for punishment as legitimate, and because they didn't perceive it as legitimate, they didn't respond to the punishment in such a way as, I've done the wrong thing, I've been punished for it, I won't do the wrong thing again, because that's the outcome you effectively want. They didn't respond that way. Now, remember, we're talking 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old kids here. They didn't respond that way. They took the view that the punishments and the reasons for the punishments were not legitimate, so they just had to get more crafty, more underhanded, more wily, more devious in not getting caught. That their mission, as they saw it, wasn't to not do the things that were causing the punishment to be meted out. Their thing was to just not get caught. That's just the view they took, and that sort of surprised me. So you'd see them getting caned for doing something, and the very next day they'd be doing the same thing. In fact, even with more aggression and purpose and sense of mission than they had in the previous day. They get caught again, they get caned again, and yet they would still do it. And that surprised me. I thought, why is this not working? I mean, I wouldn't want to get the cane every day. But they didn't perceive it as legitimate, and they were, immigrants in a new country. And this is after the debacle in the Lebanon in the Middle East and so on during that time, and following that time, there's a hangover there. And so they would. Some of them had come to Australia at a quite young age, so they'd been in Australia certainly since they started primary school. So at least 7 years they spoke. Well, not all of them, but most of them spoke English well enough. Some of them didn't speak English so good. They're fairly more recent. But they took this view that the laws weren't legitimate, or the causes weren't legitimate. So they didn't really have to abide by it. Why should they have to abide by it? Now, the same goes for things like they would steal. For example, I remember multiple situations where they would start stealing. They'd go to the medical cabinet in the carpentry, the woodworking, as they called it, room, and they'd go into that and just start stuffing their pockets full of whatever was in there. The teacher would catch them, and they'd have a full-blown punch-up with the teacher. Other Arabic people would then join in, and there'd be like almost a free-for-all. Other teachers would come in, and then these kids the police would be called, and it was that sort of thing. But it didn't seem to stop them. They still persisted with it on this basis that, as I understand it, they just didn't perceive it as legitimate. I was unlucky to get caught. I did nothing wrong. Why can't I just take what's in the medical cabinet? Why not? Well, because white man says I can't. I mean, why? How should that stop me? Why should that stop me? So these things. Now, at that same school, I mean, I got caned while I was at high school. I came away with the view, well, it doesn't act as a deterrent for them, and they're typically caught red-handed. They're not as they're wily and crafty and so on. They may be, but not enough to not get caught. You wouldn't call them surreptitious in their rule breaking. So I remember at some time there was some teacher getting comes to legitimacy here. There was some teacher that was poetry class or something like that, and she wanted to play a recording of some poem that was quite a long one. It went for 15, 20 minutes or something. It was almost the end of the class. So I pointed out that I thought I was being helpful, by the way, that the lesson ended in 5 minutes, but the poetry recital went for 20 minutes, so there wouldn't be enough time for it. And I said, and I thought I was being helpful. The teacher, who was this little girly girl, she looked at, I remember her eyes sort of narrowed, looked at me, how dare you speak so rudely to me? And I thought, what did I say? And so how it worked in those days, they wrote a little note, put inside a little envelope, and you had to take it to I think it was the principal or the deputy principal. I think it was the deputy principal, and you would get punished for it. Now the punishment in those days was the cane. So detention detention was used for girls, but for boys it was the cane. So I opened the note, because the envelope didn't seal properly. You could lift the seal off and then read what was in it and then reseal it. Remember, it was a cold winter's day, And so the note said, very rude, very, I think it was, rude boy, please deal with severely. And I thought, what? Very rude? You're kidding me. Severely? Why? So straight away, even at the age of 11 or whatever I was then, I thought, this is not right. I've been neither rude, and nor would what I've done warrant severe punishment. So I thought, not a problem. I'll explain this to the deputy principal and say, well, look, this is what happened, and argue or plead my case. And so I get there and I try to explain it. He's not interested, not even in the slightest. So he then inserts that I'm being rude to him. So I got a few, as they called it, cuts of the cane. On this cold day, it hurt like hell. But I came away with the view from that well, hold on, this is rando. You've just arbitrarily decided. Now it turns out that this deputy principal and this younger woman, I doubt she's more than 25, are having an intimate relationship. So she's show me how big and tough you are, and you can fuck me twice as hard tonight. So it would have been a sadomasochistic sexual type sort of loop happening there. Show me how strong you are, you hairy chested man, fuck me twice as hard. So there was that going on as well, which was obviously a perversion of the purpose of corporal punishment. There was also another incident that I recall, where a teacher claimed that he'd seen somebody lighting a cigarette lighter, and this would have been like third year high school. This is in a different school, and so he's a short-term teacher, and he's a bit of a thug, I think, but a bit of a hood, a bit of a goon, this teacher. Bit out of place at that school. Anyway, he says he claimed he saw a lighter. That's possible. A couple of kids in the group, 20 of us or something, a couple of kids in the group did smoke. So more as a pose than they actually did smoke. So he said, okay, well, the guilty party needs to come forward. And if the guilty party doesn't come forward, I'll cane you all. So four cuts of the cane. I'll cane you all over the period of the next few days unless the guilty party. Now, I had accepted, even at that age, I took exception to that. Hold on a minute, you just arbitrarily decide you think you've seen something. You then arbitrarily mete out corporal punishment on the basis you think you might have seen it. Where's your evidence, buddy? And this idea that the guilty party doesn't come forward, you're going to cane everybody? Nah. If you call me up for the cane, then I'm not putting my hand out for it. You're not caning me, but not for this. So that was the view that I took. So I took the view that it was not legitimate. So it was not even-handed. It was not legitimate, and it was arbitrary, and so therefore illegitimate. Now that was, of course, my view as a kid. Now looking at different schools and different classes, different places, the school with all those Arab kids, the canings were, a gazillion canings every day, as I say, the police around every day. That's the sort of place it was. Now in an upmarket, very homogenous, all-white school, the police never came, and caning was quite rare. I'm just trying to think if I can remember the cane ever being administered. Everyone was quite well behaved. The standard of behaviour at this place was very different. It was a much wealthier area, but the idea of being socially shamed and the shame of having your parents contacted, your father contacted at work. And as I've mentioned in other videos, there's kids are in a class. I mean, the height of bad behaviour at this homogenous, quite well-to-do area of school. The height of bad behaviour was scrunching up papers and throwing them at each other. That was being edgy and bad at that sort of place. I remember at one class the teacher wasn't around or something like that, and we were busily throwing papers and goodness knows what at each other, and the form master came in and pointed to somebody, hey you. Do we have your father's work phone number on file in the office? And then suddenly everyone meekly went back to their seats, sat there very quietly, blushing bright crimson as they contemplated the possibility of their father getting a call at work from the principal. Now at the other school, it was, say the school where there was all the Arabs at it, that would have had zero effect. So the idea was that the system, the laws that governed it and the behaviour and the codes of behaviour were completely legitimate, and social shaming and responsibility and obligation to the civis, all this sort of stuff was ingrained in some people and not in others. And so just the mere threat of the father being called at work about that was enough to instill total obedience and silence in the students, who again would have been 14, 15 years old at the time. So very different. Now the law, if you look at the law, say in the 90s, certainly as I recall as a kid, and I'm only a little kid here at this point, but laws were very much to protect property and ownership. Assault with menaces to extract money out of people, extortion, this was considered very serious. Theft was considered serious, and various downstream. So if you received stolen goods, then that was a crime almost equivalent to the theft itself. So I remember there's a guy in the area that I lived in when I was a kid, and he'd supposedly bought I think it was a camera or maybe a record player, something like that, and it had been stolen, and he bought it from somebody had paid them for it, but he got dragged into court for this. It was argued that he must have known that it was stolen, and therefore he was an accessory to the theft. And can you believe it? I mean, this is like, he didn't steal it. He's committed no crime. He just paid somebody for it. Turns out it was stolen, and they insisted he must have known. If he didn't know, he should have known. And how can you buy it at such a good price? You must have known it was stolen. And he got 6 months in prison for that. In prison. I mean, not a suspended sentence, not a community service, or not there. 6 months in prison for what was considered a crime of receiving stolen goods. Now, he was a pariah, almost an outcast in society, and he had to engage. He had to work on weekends for all sorts of charitable causes for months to sort of undo that. And I remember all the adults talking about it, and the only way he could restore his hitherto good name again was to do many months. It could even be longer in doing charity work at hospitals and goodness knows what, in order to again redeem himself in the eyes of the local community. All he did was pay for something that someone else had stolen. 6 months in prison. I mean, you are kidding. But that's how it was then. So the idea of the law was seen by some people back in the time as being, well, the laws are just there to protect the rich, to protect the haves, and to punish the have-nots. And people who have lots of money and great jobs and lots of things, lots of gadgets, they don't need to steal because they have everything. The people who don't have the gadgets are the ones who are going to steal, and therefore the laws oppress them and support those who exploit the working. So it was along class lines that the law then was seen as being a class thing. The laws are there to protect the rich and punish the poor. Now you could argue that throughout history, but the idea of what punishment should be have been going on throughout history. Thousands of years, the state has been trying to balance, well, how can we deter criminal acts without having to pay vast sums of money for a police force. So most governments throughout history have resorted to the most terrifying things, hang drawn and quartered and heads on pikes, this sort of stuff, because this will be a terrifying warning to people. If you get caught, this is what's going to happen. But the chances of getting caught were quite slim. Also, things like public humiliation being put in the stocks where people sort of are invited to throw rotten eggs at you or rotten fruit and vegetables and things like that. It's meant to be a complete public humiliation, so you don't do it again. Now, in the Sharia law type places, if you steal, you're supposed to have your hand cut off and so on. I don't know what burden of proof the state takes upon itself. If you're going to cut someone's hands off, that would be pretty serious. This used to happen in medieval Britain. If you'd written something that was regarded as seditious, criticising the government or the king or whatever, the aristocracy, then they could cut your hand off because it was your hand that wrote those words. So off goes your hand. So they could and did do that. In medieval Europe, or Britain in particular, they tended to do it more for defiance against the government than for the petty crime itself or the crime of theft or whatever. So it was done slightly differently there, whereas in the Sharia law, which is certainly around in medieval times, the idea was to deter criminal acts such as theft in this case, but also things like adultery. So if a woman covers up her entire body, then the chances or possibility of adultery are far less than if her body was fully exposed and so on. Now, looking at what punishments could be put in place in terms of physical punishments today that might make a difference, I don't know that they would. Places like Singapore kept the old colonial laws of birching or caning, and the people get caned on their ass there for it's quite severe apparently. I think they call it the rattan, the cane, and but there's Singapore is a very clean place that seems to be very free from criminal activity. I've been there many times, and walked around at night in the downtown area, and have never been subject to, at any time, subject to any sort of criminal act. And I've known women who've again walk around at night on their own, and the same sort of thing. Now, is that a population that believes the laws to be legitimate, or believes they've got an obligation, responsibility to the civis? Is it fear of being imprisoned or caned? School children in Singapore get taken to the prisons and shown how unpleasant things are in order to act as a deterrent. But are they just sort of much better behaved people? Are they inclined to good behaviour because they believe in the laws, or believe in their legitimacy, or believe that they'll be scrupulously and even-handedly applied? So the laws, so in coming to a summary now, if the laws are believed to be legitimate, they're evenly and equally applied, then and that the people are taught that the laws are there for the benefit of everybody. If people don't steal and don't kill, it's to everyone's ultimate benefit for social harmony and social cohesion and so on. So whereas minorities in the West today, non-whites are taught, even women are taught that the laws are not legitimate. They're patriarchal, they're misogynist, they're oppressive, they're racist, they're colonial, they're this, they're that. Why should anybody who's not white abide by the laws when they're that illegitimate? I want a black prosecutor, I want a black policeman and a black judge and unless I get that, I'm being oppressed. The law is thus illegitimate, and so on. So legitimacy needs to be inculcated in the population. That's much easier with a homogenous population, but it still can be done. And again, I think Singapore is an example of that. There's a large Malay, Indian population it's majority Chinese, but it certainly seems to me to be a very safe and very clean place. Great place to do business, by the way. So clearly it can work in a multicultural society. But is it because of the cane, or is it because everyone believes the laws to be legitimate and to be evenly and fairly applied. Now look at the laws today, and we'll look at Britain as or other Western countries, but Britain is a recent one where black people can run around machetes on the street and or can beat up police at airports and so on. And the state doesn't really care. It's okay, no big deal. But if a white person goes on the street and protests against immigration, then they're dragged straight into prison. So the laws aren't applied evenly, far from it. And you see it recently in Australia. Someone supposedly guilty of a white guy guilty of domestic violence, or allegedly, it is alleged he's guilty of it. That's quickly dragged into court, and he's dealt with. But when it's a non-white guy that does the same thing, it's weeks later, months later, the matter still hasn't come to court. Recently, a non-white guy beat up and knifed, a number of women, and the court case took 10 weeks to come to court. And it was a laid, the guy's dead to rights. I mean, there's not like there's much to argue about in terms of the details. You had a very vague sort of situation where he said, she said thing. He's dragged quickly into court, and the white guy is dealt with almost summarily. So clearly the law's not being applied equally, and we're in an era of ideological law, where ideologically the white guy is the evil oppressor and must be dealt with severely, and the brown guy or the woman or the minority or supposed minority is the ideological minimal social power victim, and they don't have to be dealt with severely. So straight away we've got a bifurcation of the law, its application. So in my view, a law that is not clearly codified, hate speech, for example, is not clearly codified and is dealt with ideologically on the basis of arbitrarily presumed social power that one person has but another doesn't, or doesn't have as much of, then the law is applied very differently and not evenly and not universally. And therefore, is it legitimate? If it's not clearly codified and is applied ideologically, how can it possibly be legitimate? It can be whatever the state wants it to be, which is where I think we're heading at the moment. So how could punishment be applied? Corporal punishment, the birching, the cane, whatever you want to call it, be applied, or some sort of pain-inflicting punishment. How could it be applied so it can be seen as legitimate and not arbitrary, and it could be evenly applied? For example, so that white guy there, he spat on the sidewalk. Oh, well, beat the shit out of him. But this brown guy, he murdered 10 people. Well, that's all right. He doesn't have as much social power, so we can't punish him. And would people from non-white backgrounds view it as physical punishment as legitimate? Because they don't see it as legitimate, and they don't see it as something they should respect. Then would it have any effect? Putting someone in prison for 20 years doesn't seem to have any effect. Community service orders don't seem to have any effect. I mean, what can you do to control people that believe that your society is illegitimate, your laws are illegitimate, everything about you is illegitimate? And then they would quite reasonably say, well, why should I care about law? Anything they do to me will just increase my victimhood and is proof of the injustice that I'm suffering. So it's a big issue, and I don't know where it's going to go. But I'd look forward to hearing your views below. I don't think physical punishment would really change much. It might, but I don't think it would.